In the busy halls of St. Mary's Hospital, Emily Carter, a compassionate nurse struggling to make ends meet, is assigned to care for the grumpiest patient she's ever met, a difficult elderly man named Henry. Unknown to her, Henry isn't just any patient. He's the billionaire owner of the hospital, secretly testing the staff's integrity. As Emily patiently endures his endless complaints and demands, she has no idea her kindness is about to change both their lives forever. Can genuine compassion truly melt the hardest heart? And what happens when Emily learns the truth behind Henry's disguise? Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? Emily Carter rushed down the bustling hallway of St. Mary's Hospital, clutching her coffee mug in one hand and a stack of patient charts in the other. It was barely sunrise, yet she'd already been working for hours, navigating a sea of medical carts and hurried colleagues. Her eyes stung from exhaustion, but she knew there were no breaks in sight. Not today, not when the ER was already flooded with patients after a highway accident. "Emily, wait!" A voice called from behind her. She paused, turning to see her friend and fellow nurse, Sarah, catching up with an anxious expression. "What's wrong?" Emily asked, reading the look of distress on Sarah's face. "They're giving you room 317, Sarah explained nervously, biting her lip as though preparing for a backlash. "Henry Collins, the patient everyone warned us about." Emily groaned inwardly, closing her eyes briefly as she gathered her composure. She'd heard plenty of horror stories about this man, grumpy, irritable, and demanding to the point of cruelty. But she quickly reminded herself of why she'd become a nurse in the first place. Every patient deserved kindness, even the difficult ones. "It's fine," Emily replied with a weary smile. "I'll handle it." Sarah looked relieved. "Thanks, Em. I owe you one." Emily took a sip of her lukewarm coffee as she made her way toward Henry's room. The caffeine barely registered anymore, but she appreciated the comforting ritual nonetheless. She knocked gently on the door marked 317, took a deep breath, and pushed it open. The room felt cold, sterile, the silence immediately oppressive. Sitting upright in the hospital bed with a sour expression etched onto his aged face was Henry Collins. His steel-gray eyes narrowed suspiciously as he watched Emily enter. "Good morning, Mr. Collins," Emily said warmly, offering her most genuine smile. "I'm Emily. I'll be taking care of you today. How are you feeling?" Henry glared, clearly unimpressed. "If I were feeling fine, do you think I'd be stuck in here? And you're late, by the way." Emily glanced briefly at the clock. She wasn't late, not even by a minute, but she forced her smile wider, determined not to let him bait her. "Well, I'm here now. Let's get you feeling better." He huffed dismissively, folding his arms. Emily ignored the sting of his words, quickly busying herself with his vitals and paperwork. She knew her day had just become infinitely harder, but she refused to give in. Little did she know this stubborn patient was about to change everything. Emily gently adjusted the blood pressure cuff around Henry's thin, bony arm, careful not to cause him any unnecessary discomfort. She glanced up, catching the old man's critical gaze boring into her, almost daring her to make a mistake. Henry exhaled sharply, shaking his head in exaggerated irritation. "Is something wrong, Mr. Collins?" she asked softly, maintaining a calm tone despite the building tension in her chest. "Everything's wrong," Henry snapped bitterly. "This bed feels like sleeping on rocks. The food tastes like cardboard, and this blasted room is colder than an icebox. Is this how you people treat paying patients?" Emily swallowed her frustration and forced another patient smile. "I'm sorry you're feeling uncomfortable, Mr. Collins. I'll speak to maintenance about the temperature, and I'll bring you an extra blanket." Henry scoffed loudly. "A blanket? You think one blanket fixes incompetence? If I ran this hospital, half of you would have been fired by now." Emily's hand froze for a split second, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She'd handled difficult patients before, but something about Henry's unrelenting criticism felt sharper, more personal. Still, she knew arguing back would only escalate things. With practiced patience, she quietly made notes on her chart, reminding herself again why she had chosen nursing. It wasn't always easy, but people like Henry deserved compassion too, even if they didn't appreciate it. Henry watched her silently for a moment, his expression slightly softened by curiosity. "What's wrong? No witty comeback? No excuses?" Emily looked up from her paperwork, meeting his piercing stare head-on. "I know it's not ideal here," she answered carefully, "but we're doing everything we can to help you feel comfortable and get better. I understand it's frustrating." Henry huffed dismissively, shaking his head again. "You understand? You have no idea. When you reach my age, you learn there's no room in life for empty platitudes. Either do your job properly or find someone who can." A brief silence stretched between them. Emily stood perfectly still, her pulse quickening slightly, unsure how to respond without escalating the situation further. Finally, she exhaled slowly and nodded gently. "I'll do my best, Mr. Collins. If there's anything else you need, please let me know." Henry waved his hand dismissively, turning his head away toward the window. "Go on. Do your best somewhere else, nurse." Emily quietly stepped back toward the door, pausing to glance once more at Henry. Beneath his anger and bitterness, she sensed loneliness, a man accustomed to barking orders and having others jump to attention. She couldn't help but wonder what had brought him here, why he hid behind such unyielding hostility. "I'll be back shortly," she said gently, slipping into the hallway, letting the door click softly behind her. Taking a deep breath, Emily closed her eyes briefly, gathering her composure before moving on to her next task. Little did she know, behind that closed door, Henry watched thoughtfully, a spark of intrigue lighting his tired eyes. Emily's day stretched on endlessly, a blur of buzzing monitors, hurried footsteps, and murmured requests. Yet, through every passing hour, she found her thoughts drifting back to Henry Collins, the patient whose relentless criticisms left a lingering sting. She dreaded returning to his room, feeling her anxiety spike each time she checked her watch. Still, she knew avoiding him would only worsen things. With a heavy sigh, she gathered fresh linens, medication, and a steaming cup of tea, bracing herself for another round. When she entered his room again, Henry was sitting upright, glaring at the television screen in disdain. "Ridiculous," he muttered bitterly, shaking his head at the daytime talk show playing softly in the background. "Is this the best entertainment this overpriced facility can provide?" Emily forced a calm smile. "I brought you some tea," she said softly, placing the cup carefully on his bedside table. "Chamomile. It might help you relax." Henry eyed the cup suspiciously. "Relax? You try relaxing in this prison. I'd find better peace of mind in solitary confinement." Emily suppressed a sigh, carefully unfolding a fresh blanket across his legs. He immediately shifted irritably, tugging at the fabric in annoyance. "You call this comfortable?" he snapped, scowling. "It scratches my skin like sandpaper. What kind of nurse doesn't know a decent blanket from trash?" Emily's jaw tightened slightly, heat rising to her cheeks as she inhaled slowly. The frustration bubbled up inside her, but she pushed it back down with practiced patience. She gently took the blanket back, her voice steady, despite the turmoil beneath the surface. "I'll see if we have something softer, Mr. Collins." As she adjusted his pillow, Henry watched her carefully, scrutinizing every movement as though searching for any tiny misstep. Emily felt exposed, vulnerable, beneath the harsh intensity of his gaze. Internally, she questioned how long she could withstand this treatment, wondering if perhaps she was truly failing him as a caregiver. "Tell me something," Henry said abruptly, his tone slightly softer, catching her off guard. "Why haven't you quit yet? I've had nurses leave crying after half an hour, yet you persist. Is it stubbornness or stupidity?" Emily met his gaze, momentarily speechless. Her pulse quickened, but she steadied herself, deciding honesty was her best choice. "Neither," she answered quietly. "It's compassion. Everyone deserves care, even on their worst days." Henry's eyes flickered briefly with something Emily couldn't quite identify. Perhaps surprise, perhaps skepticism. He didn't respond, instead turning his attention back to the television, effectively dismissing her. Emily quietly left the room, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion and self-doubt. Leaning against the hallway wall, she let out a shaky breath, questioning herself. Was compassion truly enough to break through such stubborn resistance? Could kindness really soften a heart hardened by years of bitterness? What she didn't see was Henry glancing thoughtfully at the door she just closed, his expression unexpectedly softened, wrestling silently with questions of his own. As the sun dipped lower beyond the wide hospital windows, casting a warm amber glow through the blinds, Henry sat quietly in his hospital bed, eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The room had grown quieter now, the earlier hustle of nurses and doctors fading into a gentle hum of evening routines. The monitors beeped softly beside him, a rhythmic reminder of his carefully constructed facade. Reaching carefully to the side table, he lifted a small leather notebook, thumbing through scribbled observations with practiced deliberation. Pages were filled with notes, brief character sketches of nurses, janitors, doctors, staff he had secretly watched and evaluated over the past several days. But tonight his focus rested squarely on one nurse in particular, Emily Carter. He replayed each encounter with Emily carefully in his mind, dissecting her every response, her expressions, her unwavering composure under pressure. She intrigued him more than he'd ever admit aloud. He'd pushed her far harder than anyone else, his harsh demeanor deliberately magnified to gauge how deeply her patience ran. Yet she refused to crack, and despite his brutal criticisms, she never showed him anything but genuine compassion. Henry's gaze drifted thoughtfully toward the doorway, where moments earlier Emily had exited, visibly exhausted, but still somehow holding herself with dignity. A small twinge of guilt pulled at him, something he hadn't anticipated feeling during this test. But he'd long ago learned that the truth was only revealed under strain, when people thought no one important was watching. Pulling out a pen, he carefully wrote beside Emily's name: caring, patient, remarkably resilient, potential leadership. He paused, then added quietly, "She cares deeply, even when faced with unearned hostility." Suddenly the door opened slightly, snapping him from his introspection. Henry quickly slipped the notebook beneath the pillow, masking his features once again with practiced irritation. But it was only an orderly, quietly placing fresh towels in the bathroom. Once alone again, Henry sighed softly, feeling the weight of his true identity pressing heavily upon him. He was no mere patient. He was Henry Alexander, billionaire entrepreneur and founder of St. Mary's Hospital. His disguise had been intended as a straightforward means of observing staff anonymously, yet something about Emily was complicating things, pushing at the edges of his carefully controlled experiment. What had begun as a routine test of integrity had become deeply personal. Emily was challenging his assumptions about people, making him reconsider whether perhaps his view of the world had become too cynical. Could genuine kindness exist without conditions? Was Emily truly as selfless as she seemed, or was it just another act he'd grown accustomed to detecting? He settled back into his bed, eyes scanning the dimming sky outside, pondering these unexpected feelings. For the first time since he'd entered the hospital in disguise, Henry felt uncertain, not just about Emily, but about himself. Little did Emily know, as she moved tirelessly through the corridors outside, her smallest actions had already begun to shake the foundations of Henry Alexander's carefully constructed world. The evening shift had brought a quiet calm to the hospital, a lull between waves of emergencies. Emily stepped quietly into Henry's room, carrying his dinner tray and medication. She moved carefully, expecting another round of bitter complaints about the food, the temperature, or anything else Henry might find wrong today. To her surprise, however, Henry remained silent, his eyes fixed thoughtfully on the window as twilight painted soft streaks across the sky. "I've brought your dinner, Mr. Collins," Emily said gently. placing the tray on his bedside table. Her voice was tired, but still carried the warm kindness that had become her trademark. Henry turned slowly, observing her with a sharp intensity. "You look tired," he said bluntly, but there was a faint gentleness hidden behind his gruff words. Emily hesitated, slightly taken aback. She wasn't accustomed to him noticing anything about her, except mistakes. "It's been a long day," she admitted softly, arranging his silverware carefully beside the plate. "But that's part of the job." He regarded her silently, picking at the edge of his blanket. "I suppose dealing with difficult patients doesn't make it easier," he muttered, almost grudgingly. Emily allowed herself a quiet smile. "No," she confessed softly, "but it's worth it. I chose nursing because I wanted to help people, especially when they're at their most vulnerable." Henry's gaze shifted, growing even more thoughtful. "There must be easier ways to earn a living," he said, sounding almost curious. "A young woman like you surely has other options." Emily exhaled slowly, hesitating for a moment. Something about his unusually soft tone broke through her walls of professional detachment. "Honestly, it's not just about the money," she said carefully. "Though I won't pretend finances aren't tight. My younger brother, he's sick. Treatments are expensive. Our parents passed away a few years ago, so it's just us now. I'm the only one who can keep us afloat." Henry's expression flickered, a crack forming briefly in his carefully maintained facade. "How old is your brother?" he asked quietly, his voice losing its usual edge. "He's 15, Emily answered softly, "and brave beyond his years. He fights every day, and if he can keep fighting, then so can I." Henry glanced down at his hands, clearly lost in thought. Silence stretched between them, surprisingly comfortable compared to their earlier tense exchanges. Finally, Henry cleared his throat awkwardly, his voice gruff again but tinged with genuine sincerity. "Your brother? He's lucky to have someone like you." Emily felt a warmth rising in her chest, surprised and touched by the unexpected compliment. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice nearly catching. Gathering her composure, she straightened, adjusting her professional mask once more. "Anyway, let me know if there is anything else you need." Henry merely nodded, turning again toward the window, but Emily noticed the hardness had faded from his eyes. As she closed the door quietly behind her, she couldn't help but wonder if, beneath Henry's tough exterior, there was a hidden kindness waiting to emerge. What she didn't see was Henry, reaching slowly beneath his pillow, pulling out his leather notebook to jot down a single, reflective word beside her name: remarkable. Emily had barely managed a sip of coffee when her pager buzzed frantically, sending a jolt of anxiety through her tired body. Glancing down, her stomach sank at the room number blinking on the screen. 317. Henry Collins. Taking a deep breath, she quickly abandoned her short-lived break and headed towards his room, mentally preparing herself for whatever fresh trouble he'd dreamed up this time. As she stepped inside, Henry was already sitting upright, arms folded defiantly, wearing a deep scowl. His voice cracked sharply. "Took your time, didn't you?" Emily swallowed her instinctive frustration, forcing a steady calm into her tone. "I came as soon as you paged, Mr. Collins. What seems to be the issue?" He gestured angrily at the sheets twisted around his legs. "These sheets are impossible. I told you earlier, they itch. They're suffocating me, and now they're twisted tighter than a rope. Am I supposed to rest under such conditions?" Emily suppressed a weary sigh. She knew perfectly well he'd purposely tangled himself in the bedding, making an ordinary situation as difficult as possible. She stepped forward, patiently straightening and smoothing the sheets with practiced hands. Henry watched her closely, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Anything else I can help with?" Emily asked gently when she'd finished. Henry hesitated, his eyes glinting mischievously. "Actually, yes. I've changed my mind about dinner. Whatever they've prepared tonight won't do. I want fresh soup, and not just any soup. Homemade chicken soup, exactly the way my mother used to make. Think you can handle that, Nurse Carter?" Emily felt her pulse quicken with stress. aware of the near impossibility of fulfilling his request, given the hospital kitchen's limited menu. But she caught herself before responding hastily. Henry was testing her patience again, deliberately setting her up to fail, and she was determined not to rise to the bait. "Mr. Collins, homemade chicken soup isn't typically available here," Emily began gently, meeting his eyes with compassion rather than frustration. "But let me see what I can do." Without giving him time to respond, she slipped into the hallway and rushed towards the hospital kitchen, a determined plan already forming in her mind. Gathering ingredients she could find, she quickly and skillfully improvised, heating broth and adding fresh vegetables from the cafeteria supplies, seasoning carefully, imagining what might closely resemble the comfort Henry had described. Nearly 40 minutes later, she returned, carrying the bowl carefully into Henry's room. He looked genuinely startled at her arrival, his expression softening briefly, before his mask of irritation snapped back into place. "Took you long enough," he muttered. Emily ignored the criticism, setting the bowl down in front of him with quiet confidence. "It might not be exactly your mother's recipe, but I hope it brings you some comfort," she said softly, turning to leave before he could find further fault. As the door quietly shut behind her, Henry stared down at the soup, stunned into silence. Slowly, he raised the spoon to his lips, tasting it with skepticism. Yet, as the warmth flooded through him, he felt a rare pang of guilt at how harshly he'd treated her. Alone, he reached again beneath his pillow, scribbling in his notebook one quiet word beneath her name: exceptional. Emily's feet throbbed painfully as she moved through the dimly lit corridor toward Henry's room. She felt utterly drained, her body screaming for rest after a relentless 12-hour shift. Her stomach growled quietly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since early that morning. Yet the persistent buzz of Henry's pager continued to tug at her attention, dragging her forward step by weary step. When she finally entered his room, Henry's eyes locked onto her immediately, filled with a hardened expectation she had grown painfully familiar with. He sat rigidly upright, his mouth twisted into a sour expression, a dramatic sigh escaping him. "Oh, good. You have finally decided to grace me with your presence," Henry began bitterly, glancing pointedly at the wall clock. "Have you forgotten the meaning of urgency?" Emily felt her patience fraying, yet forced herself to maintain composure. "I'm sorry, Mr. Collins. It's been an extremely busy evening. What can I do for you?" He folded his arms defiantly, studying her with piercing intensity. "The pillows. They're still not right. Too soft, too firm. How many times do I have to explain comfort to you? Is basic competence truly that elusive around here?" Emily's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the edge of her clipboard. Her exhaustion surged into frustration, threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained professional facade. Still, she exhaled slowly, gripping onto the last shred of patience she could muster. "Let me see what I can do," she responded quietly, adjusting the pillows once again, fluffing and shifting them gently. Henry watched her every movement, skepticism etched deeply in his features. Suddenly he shook his head with deliberate disdain. "Hopeless. Utterly hopeless. Perhaps you're simply incapable of providing proper care. It's astonishing. This hospital continues to employ someone so consistently inadequate." His harsh words cut deeper than Emily had anticipated, tearing into her resilience. For a fleeting moment, tears stung sharply at her eyes, her breath hitching slightly. The cruelty felt unnecessary, intentionally hurtful, testing the absolute limits of her emotional endurance. She turned slightly, shielding her eyes from his penetrating gaze, quickly blinking back the threat of tears. But in that vulnerable moment, something inside her hardened. She wouldn't let Henry see her broken. Straightening slowly, Emily took a deep, steadying breath, facing him once again with a dignity he hadn't anticipated. "I'm truly sorry you're unhappy," she said softly, but firmly. "I'm doing my absolute best, Mr. Collins, because I care. I wish you could see that." She turned quietly and left the room, the door clicking gently shut behind her, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Alone, Henry stared thoughtfully at the door, the harshness of his words replaying in his mind with unexpected discomfort. Emily's quiet strength had caught him off guard, leaving him unsettled and strangely remorseful. Reaching slowly under his pillow, he opened the leather notebook, pausing before carefully adding beneath her name in his shaky handwriting, "Extraordinary strength under pressure." He closed the notebook slowly, troubled yet intrigued, quietly aware that Emily Carter was unlike anyone he had encountered before, and somehow, deep down, he knew she had just changed everything. Emily was midway through organizing supplies in the nurse's station when her pager erupted into a frantic chorus of beeps. Her heart dropped as she glanced down to read the room number 317. Henry. But this time, there was something different, a flashing red urgency signaling genuine distress. Adrenaline surged through her veins, and she sprinted down the hallway, fear gripping her chest. When she burst into Henry's room, the scene made her blood run cold. Henry was gasping for air, eyes wide and panicked, his fingers clutching at his chest desperately. The usual mask of irritation had vanished completely, replaced by pure vulnerability. His lips moved silently, struggling to form words he couldn't find the breath to speak. "Mr. Collins!" Emily cried, racing to his side. She pressed the emergency button urgently with one hand while swiftly checking his pulse and oxygen levels with the other. She spoke quickly, calmly, desperately, attempting to soothe him. "It's okay. You're not alone. I'm right here. Stay calm. Breathe slowly. Help is on the way." Henry's eyes met hers, panic shining clearly in them, begging silently for reassurance. Gone was the harsh critic who had tested her limits. In his place lay an elderly man overwhelmed by vulnerability and fear. Emily took his trembling hand gently, gripping it reassuringly, her gaze filled with unwavering compassion. "Henry, just breathe with me, okay? I promise you, you're going to be fine." As medical personnel flooded the room moments later, chaos erupted around them. Yet through it all, Emily never let go of Henry's hand. She remained close, softly encouraging him, her calming presence unwavering even amid the flurry of urgent commands and rapid movements. Finally, Henry's breathing steadied, the terrifying tightness in his chest easing gradually under careful medical attention. Once the doctors had finished their work and the urgency had subsided, the room slowly emptied again, leaving Emily alone at Henry's bedside, still holding his frail, trembling hand. Henry's eyes flickered open slowly, filled now with an unfamiliar softness as they locked onto Emily's gentle, concerned face. You stayed," he whispered, voice barely audible. Emily's expression softened even further, offering him a warm, comforting smile. "Of course I stayed. I wasn't going to leave you." A quiet, unexpected vulnerability broke through Henry's typically hardened exterior, his eyes glistening with a quiet gratitude. He stared at her for a long moment, seemingly trying to make sense of the sincerity reflected in her gaze. "Why?" he finally whispered hoarsely. "After everything I've put you through, why show me such kindness?" Emily squeezed his hand gently, her heart aching slightly at the genuine confusion and loneliness behind his question. "Because you deserve care, Henry. Everyone does, even when they pretend they don't." In that silent moment, Henry felt something shift deep within himself, a wall slowly beginning to crumble. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly feel the warmth of another person's compassion. And as Emily quietly stayed by his side, her presence unwavering, he began to understand just how extraordinary she truly was, and how desperately he needed someone like her in his life. Henry sat propped against his pillows, eyes fixed thoughtfully on the closed door through which Emily had quietly departed just moments before. The hospital room was silent, save for the soft, steady hum of medical equipment. For the first time since beginning this strange experiment, he felt uncertain, confused even. The nurse he had deliberately pushed to the brink had responded not with anger, resentment, or hostility, but with unwavering kindness, an empathy that had shaken something deep within him. He reached carefully beneath his pillow, retrieving his worn leather notebook. Flipping through its pages slowly, his eyes lingered on the brief notes scribbled beside Emily's name. Each word was a testament to her resilience, compassion, and quiet strength. But even those descriptions now felt inadequate, superficial, compared to the sincerity he'd witnessed during his medical crisis. Henry's fingers traced the ink thoughtfully. He wondered what drove Emily, what had shaped someone so selfless, so compassionate, even in the face of relentless criticism. Was it merely professionalism, or was there a deeper, more personal motivation hidden behind her actions? Lost in thought, he barely noticed the door easing open gently until Emily appeared again, balancing a tray carrying medication, water, and a small vase holding freshly picked daisies. "You're still awake," she remarked softly, surprise flickering briefly across her tired face. "You should be resting." Henry studied her carefully, noticing the shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes, the subtle strain of worry lingering in her expression. "Sleep has never come easily to me," he admitted quietly. He paused, his usual biting tone notably absent. "May I ask you something?" Emily's eyes widened slightly in surprise, though she masked it quickly. "Of course," she responded gently, placing the vase carefully on the bedside table. The daisies, bright and cheerful, seemed to bring warmth to the sterile room. "What made you become a nurse?" Henry asked, watching her closely. His voice was gentler, genuinely curious. "There are easier ways to earn a paycheck, surely." Emily hesitated, considering her response carefully. A gentle vulnerability slipped into her expression as she spoke softly, honestly. "My brother Tommy got sick when he was just 8 years old. I watched how the nurses cared for him, not just with skills, but with kindness. They gave him hope, strength, even joy on his hardest days. I realized then that's who I wanted to become, someone who makes a real difference, not just someone who clocks in and out." Henry listened intently, her words settling deep inside him, challenging the skepticism he'd held for years. "And your brother now?" he asked quietly. Emily's voice wavered slightly, her eyes glistening faintly with unshed emotion. "Still fighting," she admitted. "Every day he shows me what real courage looks like." Henry nodded slowly, a newfound respect growing within him. Emily's story resonated deeply, reminding him of things he'd long buried beneath layers of bitterness and cynicism. "Your brother must be proud," he said softly, sincerity shining quietly in his usually hardened gaze. Emily offered him a gentle, thankful smile. "I hope so," she whispered, her voice nearly catching. Then, sensing Henry's fatigue, she added softly, "Now please, Mr. Collins, try to rest." Henry watched her leave again, his heart heavy with thoughts he'd never anticipated having. Alone once more, he took out his notebook, adding quietly beneath her name, "Truly inspiring." And for the first time in a very long while, Henry Alexander felt grateful for a nurse named Emily, who had begun to teach him something he had long forgotten, the power and grace found in genuine compassion. Sunlight streamed warmly through the blinds, casting gentle patterns across Henry's hospital bed as Emily entered the room, carefully balancing a tray of breakfast. He glanced up, meeting her gaze, a rare hint of amusement flickering briefly behind his typically stern eyes. "Ah, the dreaded hospital breakfast," Henry murmured sarcastically, eyeing the tray suspiciously as Emily placed it beside him. "Will I survive this morning's culinary assault?" Emily allowed herself a small smile, recognizing the teasing undertone she hadn't heard from him before. She feigned seriousness, playing along. "Well, Mr. Collins, surviving breakfast might depend entirely on your attitude this morning." Henry's lips twitched slightly at the corners, betraying an almost smile he quickly suppressed. "Touché, Nurse Carter," he replied, sounding begrudgingly amused. Emily paused thoughtfully, a mischievous sparkle appearing briefly in her tired eyes. "You know, not everyone has your refined taste in fine dining. Maybe next time I'll have them add caviar to your oatmeal." Henry raised an eyebrow, startled, before breaking into a soft chuckle, a genuine laugh, the first Emily had heard from him since his arrival. His shoulders seemed to relax slightly, a layer of guarded tension slipping quietly away. "I must admit," Henry finally confessed softly, "I underestimated your wit. Clearly you're more than just resilient under pressure." Emily smiled warmly, appreciating the rare sincerity in his voice. She gently adjusted his pillows, the routine act now feeling comfortable rather than stressful. "And you're more than just the difficult patient everyone warned me about," she responded quietly. "There's a human beneath that gruff exterior." Henry grew quiet, thoughtful for a moment before speaking again, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "Perhaps I've been unfair," he admitted slowly, his eyes holding genuine remorse. "Life has a way of making us build walls, Nurse Carter, especially when you reach my age." Emily met his eyes gently, nodding with understanding. "I think we all have our walls, Mr. Collins. It's just easier for some of us to show them." They exchanged a quiet, meaningful glance, the barriers between patient and caregiver momentarily dissolving. The silence lingered comfortably before Henry spoke again, his voice lightly teasing once more. "Although caviar oatmeal, really?" he asked, feigning offense. "Even a billionaire wouldn't attempt something so ghastly." Emily laughed softly, a genuine, easy laugh that filled the sterile room with warmth. "I figured I'd find your culinary limit eventually." Henry's expression softened further as he watched her, a strange warmth growing in his chest. For the first time he felt truly comfortable in her presence, not as the billionaire in disguise, not as the grumpy patient testing her resilience, but simply as Henry, an elderly man in need of connection and understanding. As Emily prepared to leave, Henry reached out instinctively, briefly touching her hand, a gesture that surprised them both. "Thank you," he whispered sincerely, "for your patience, your kindness, and your sense of humor." Emily squeezed his hand gently, warmth filling her voice. "You're welcome, Henry. I'm glad we're finally getting to know each other." As the door clicked shut behind her, Henry lay back against his pillows, quietly smiling to himself. He reached again for his notebook, carefully writing beneath Emily's name one simple, profound word: friend. And as the sunlight warmed the room, he realized, perhaps for the first time, the true depth of gratitude he felt toward this remarkable young woman. Emily hurried through the bustling corridor, arms full of medical supplies she'd gathered for the afternoon rounds. As she approached the nurses' station, she overheard the familiar voices of two senior hospital administrators, Richard Mason and Deborah Carter, discussing a particularly troublesome patient. She paused involuntarily, catching fragments of their conversation, her heart tightening as she quickly realized exactly whom they were talking about. "Room 317, Richard sighed loudly, shaking his head. "Honestly, Deborah, the complaints from the nurses about Mr. Collins just keep piling up. He's a nightmare, impossible to please, constantly making demands. The staff are exhausted." Deborah nodded sympathetically, folding her arms. "You're right. Frankly, it's unacceptable behavior. If he weren't a paying patient, we would have already discharged him. He's more trouble than he's worth." Emily's pulse quickened in irritation. Before she could stop herself, she stepped forward, clearing her throat softly but firmly, drawing both administrators' startled attention. "With all due respect," Emily began, her voice trembling slightly with quiet anger, "I don't think it's fair to talk about Mr. Collins this way. He might be demanding, but he's still our patient. And he deserves compassion and respect, just like everyone else." Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her boldness. "Emily, we appreciate your dedication, but surely you must agree he's been extremely difficult." Emily shook her head decisively, her eyes shining with determination. "Difficult or not, it's our job to provide care, even if it means going beyond our comfort zones. Mr. Collins might be tough, but he's also vulnerable and hurting. That's exactly why we're here, to help, not to judge." Her passionate words echoed briefly in the now silent hallway. Both administrators exchanged a startled glance, their expressions shifting from surprise to quiet reflection. Emily felt heat rising to her cheeks, suddenly aware of how outspoken she'd been, but she refused to apologize. She believed every word she'd said. "Very well, Emily," Deborah finally conceded softly, a note of respect in her voice. "We'll consider your perspective. Thank you." Emily nodded politely, turning quickly away to conceal the flush spreading across her cheeks. As she moved down the hallway, her heart raced with a mixture of pride and anxiety, still shocked at her own boldness. She stepped quietly into Henry's room moments later, unaware he'd overheard her impassioned defense through the slightly open door. Henry was staring thoughtfully at the ceiling, his usual stern expression softened by something unfamiliar. Gratitude. "You didn't have to do that, you know," Henry remarked quietly, startling Emily. He turned slowly, locking eyes with her. His gaze was soft, thoughtful. "I know what they've been saying about me." Emily hesitated, briefly embarrassed, but quickly recovered her composure. "I meant every word," she replied softly, meeting his gaze earnestly. "You deserve respect, Henry. Everyone does." Henry watched her silently, feeling a strange warmth flooding his chest. The sincerity in her words touched him deeply, catching him off guard with their depth and intensity. "Thank you, Emily," he finally murmured quietly, sincerity filling his voice. For the first time, Henry Alexander, billionaire owner of St. Mary's Hospital, realized just how profoundly this young nurse's courage had impacted him, and just how deeply he'd begun to care about her in return. Late afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the window blinds, painting gentle streaks across Henry's hospital bed as Emily carefully adjusted the IV drip beside him. Henry sat quietly, his gaze far away, lost in thought as she worked in silence. The tension from earlier had eased somewhat, replaced by a quiet, almost comfortable companionship. "Emily," Henry began suddenly, breaking their peaceful silence. His voice carried an unusual tone, thoughtful and measured. "I've been thinking. This hospital's administration seems deeply flawed. I've noticed it in their attitude, in their standards, even in the smallest details of management." Emily paused mid-task, glancing at him with mild surprise. "You seem very familiar with hospital administration, Mr. Collins," she said gently, curiosity in her voice. "Did you used to work in the medical field?" Henry hesitated, his eyes flickering briefly with something unreadable. "Something like that," he admitted vaguely, quickly brushing off her curiosity. "But that's not important. What matters is that good people like you deserve better support. The nurses, the staff, you're the heart and soul of this place." Emily felt a quiet warmth rising inside her at his unexpected praise, but her curiosity only intensified. "You know, Mr. Collins, sometimes you talk as if you own this place," she teased lightly, smiling as she gently adjusted his pillows. Henry stiffened momentarily, his expression guarded but quickly recovered, masking his discomfort behind his usual stern demeanor. "Maybe I've just been around hospitals long enough to know how they should be run," he responded dismissively, waving off her comment as though it held no weight. But Emily couldn't help feeling slightly suspicious. There was something peculiar about his deep understanding of management structures, hospital policy, and even the smallest financial details he'd casually mentioned over the past few days. Henry seemed to possess knowledge far beyond an ordinary patient, yet she couldn't quite piece it all together. "Mr. Collins," she pressed gently, curiosity getting the better of her, "if you have experience, why don't you speak with administration directly? Your insight could help." Henry's gaze softened, but a quiet sadness flickered briefly behind his eyes. "Sometimes, Emily, people don't see what's right in front of them," he murmured quietly. "They overlook the obvious until it's almost too late." Emily met his eyes thoughtfully, sensing a deeper meaning behind his words, though its true significance remained just beyond her reach. She hesitated, feeling a gentle pull towards honesty. "It sounds like you have a lot of regrets," she ventured quietly, compassion filling her voice. Henry exhaled slowly, looking away, his voice growing softer, more reflective. "Perhaps I do, but I'm beginning to see things more clearly now, thanks to you." Emily studied his face carefully, noticing vulnerability she'd never seen before, a subtle crack in his usually impenetrable exterior. Her heart softened further, compassion mingling with curiosity as she gently touched his shoulder. "Whatever your past, Henry, I'm glad you're here," she said softly. "You've made me see things differently, too." He glanced up, startled, meeting her sincere gaze with quiet surprise. For a fleeting moment, he seemed poised to reveal everything, to finally disclose the secret he'd carefully guarded. But instead he simply nodded slowly, choosing to remain silent for now. As Emily left the room, she couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that there was much more to Henry Collins than he let on. Little did she know, she had just come closer to discovering the truth about Henry Alexander, the billionaire hospital owner hidden in plain sight, a truth that could change both their lives forever. Late that evening, under the dim glow of a bedside lamp, Henry quietly reached into the drawer of his hospital nightstand, retrieving the small leather-bound notebook. He opened it slowly, fingers brushing carefully over Emily's name, a name that had become so much more to him than merely another nurse on the hospital roster. For the first time, he felt an undeniable need to understand more deeply who this remarkable young woman truly was, beyond the brief glimpses she'd allowed him. His phone rested next to him on the bed, and after a long hesitation, he picked it up, dialing a trusted associate he'd relied upon for years. The voice answered promptly, professional yet warm. "Mr. Alexander, good evening. What can I do for you?" said James Edwards, Henry's longtime personal assistant, sounding surprised by the late-hour call. "James?" Henry began quietly, a hint of urgency woven into his usually composed voice. "I need you to look into someone discreetly, a nurse at St. Mary's named Emily Carter. Find out everything you can, but please handle it delicately." "Of course," James replied gently. "Consider it done." Henry hung up slowly, the weight of his decision settling heavily in his chest. Investigating Emily felt invasive, yet something inside compelled him to understand her burdens, to know why she carried herself with such extraordinary resilience and compassion despite every hardship he'd witnessed. Less than a day later, James returned Henry's call, speaking softly, respectfully. "I have what you requested, Mr. Alexander," James said, his tone gentle but serious. "Emily Carter lost both her parents tragically 5 years ago. Since then, she's been solely responsible for her younger brother, Tommy. He's been battling leukemia for the past 2 years. Emily works tirelessly, juggling multiple shifts to pay for his treatments and care. Financially, she's barely making ends meet." Henry listened in stunned silence, his throat tight with unexpected emotion. The truth hit him harder than he'd imagined, filling him with admiration and a deep, aching respect for Emily's quiet strength. She had endured more pain and hardship than he'd ever guessed, yet she'd never once revealed her burdens openly, never complained or wavered from her calling to serve others with kindness and empathy. "Thank you, James," Henry whispered quietly, his voice strained. "That'll be all for now." He ended the call, leaning back against his pillows as the room blurred briefly with unshed tears. A wave of guilt and remorse washed over him. How callously he'd tested her patience, how harshly he'd treated her, not knowing how heavy her private burdens already were. And yet, through every test, Emily had proven herself stronger, kinder, and braver than he had ever anticipated. Slowly, he reopened his notebook, his fingers trembling slightly as he wrote beneath her name once more, carefully adding, "Endures profound hardship with unwavering dignity." As Henry closed the notebook, he knew something within himself had shifted irrevocably. Emily was no longer merely a nurse, no longer just part of an experiment designed to evaluate his staff. She was someone truly extraordinary, someone deserving not only of his respect, but of sincere admiration, and perhaps he realized with growing certainty, someone he deeply cared for, far more than he'd ever intended. Emily stood alone in the dimly lit hallway outside Henry's room, her heart heavy, the weight of her worries pressing down on her like a physical burden. In her hands was an envelope from the hospital's billing department. Its bright red stamp reading "Urgent" seemed to scream louder than any sound in the quiet corridor. She'd opened it moments earlier, feeling the breath leave her body as she read the staggering amount owed for Tommy's latest treatments. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, threatening to fall, but she stubbornly held them back. She leaned against the cool wall, fighting for composure, her mind racing frantically for solutions. Nursing had always been her passion, her calling. But passion alone wouldn't cover Tommy's medical bills or the escalating pile of debts that now haunted her every waking moment. She thought bitterly about her tiny apartment, already stripped bare of luxuries, her own needs long forgotten in the pursuit of survival. A quiet, desperate voice whispered in her mind. Perhaps she had no choice. Perhaps it was finally time to let go of her dreams and find another job, one that offered stability rather than purpose. The idea twisted painfully in her chest, feeling like betrayal. But what choice did she have? She took a deep breath, wiping her eyes hastily as she forced herself into Henry's room. She found him quietly watching her entrance, his eyes immediately narrowing in concern, noticing instantly her pallid complexion and troubled expression. "Emily," Henry said softly, his tone gentle. "What's wrong?" For a brief moment she nearly broke down, nearly shared every painful detail with him. But she shook her head quickly, trying desperately to muster her usual warmth. "Nothing you need to worry about, Mr. Collins, just life." Henry's gaze held steady, clearly unconvinced. "Please, Emily, don't treat me like an oblivious old fool. Something's bothering you deeply." Emily's shoulders sagged slightly under his penetrating gaze, finally letting a hint of the truth slip out. "It's financial, Henry. Medical bills for Tommy. Everything's piling up, and I'm afraid I may need to find another job, something that pays better." Henry felt his heart sink sharply at her words, his throat tightening with a painful urgency he'd rarely felt before. The idea of Emily leaving, of losing her compassionate presence at the hospital, and more importantly from his life, filled him with dread he hadn't anticipated. "You can't quit nursing," he replied, desperation creeping into his voice. "You're made for this. You were born to help people." Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she met his gaze earnestly. "Believe me, I don't want to leave. But what choice do I have?" As she stepped away to busy herself at his bedside, Henry lay silently, his mind racing desperately. His conscience gnawed at him fiercely. He knew the power he held, the resources he could effortlessly provide, yet revealing his true identity now might destroy the delicate trust they'd built. Still, watching Emily silently struggle under this heavy burden felt intolerable. He resolved quietly to find a solution. Somehow, discreetly, he had to help her. Henry Alexander, the billionaire owner of St. Mary's Hospital, felt an overwhelming responsibility unlike anything he'd experienced before. He knew he couldn't lose Emily, not only because the hospital needed her, but because he had begun to realize with alarming clarity just how deeply he had come to need her too. Emily sat alone at the small table in her modest apartment, the dim overhead bulb casting shadows across the stack of unpaid bills scattered before her. Her heart felt unbearably heavy, the weight of desperation pressing painfully upon her chest. Each bill reminded her how precariously close she was to losing everything. Her eyes drifted to a framed photograph nearby, Tommy smiling brightly, his youthful eyes brimming with hope despite his illness. Emily swallowed hard, tears stinging at the back of her throat, as she wondered helplessly how much longer she could protect that fragile hope. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by a sharp knock at her door. Emily jumped slightly, startled by the unexpected interruption. Glancing at the clock, she hesitated. It was far too late for visitors. Anxiety tightened her stomach as she cautiously approached, opening the door just enough to peer out. Standing on the other side was a young courier, his expression pleasant yet businesslike. "Are you Emily Carter?" he asked politely, holding out a sealed envelope. "Yes," she replied softly, confusion creeping into her voice. "What is this?" "Urgent delivery," he explained simply, handing her the envelope. "Have a good evening, Miss Carter." As he disappeared down the hallway, Emily closed the door slowly, staring blankly at the pristine white envelope in her trembling hands. Her heart raced as she carefully opened it, pulling out a folded letter printed on expensive stationery. Her breath caught as she read the typed words. "Dear Miss Carter, an anonymous benefactor has learned of your dedication to your patients and the tremendous challenges you face daily. Your selflessness has inspired this small gesture of appreciation and support. Enclosed, you will find a certified check sufficient to cover your brother's medical expenses and ease your financial burden. You have made an immeasurable difference in the lives you've touched. Please allow someone else to make a difference in yours." Emily's fingers shook uncontrollably as she unfolded a check tucked neatly behind the letter. The sum printed clearly across the paper blurred through her tears, the figure large enough not only to cover Tommy's treatments, but also to lift the oppressive weight that had haunted her days and nights. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she sank onto the sofa, overwhelmed by relief and confusion. "Who would do this?" she whispered aloud, her voice trembling with disbelief and gratitude. Miles away in his luxurious penthouse suite overlooking the city skyline, Henry sat quietly, staring thoughtfully out the window. James stood quietly beside him, carefully observing his longtime boss. "Was everything arranged discreetly?" Henry asked softly, turning his eyes toward his assistant. "Yes, Mr. Alexander," James confirmed gently. "She received the letter and check without any issues." Henry nodded slowly, relief filling his chest. "Good. She must never know it came from me." "Understood," James replied respectfully. "But are you sure about this?" Henry exhaled slowly, the corners of his mouth curving into a gentle, sincere smile, something he'd rarely shown anyone. "Yes, Emily deserves better. She's taught me far more than she'll ever know about courage and compassion. This is the least I can do." James quietly withdrew, leaving Henry alone with his thoughts. As he stared into the night, Henry felt a profound satisfaction unlike anything he'd experienced before, knowing that, in some small way, he had eased Emily's burdens. Yet even more strongly, he felt an unfamiliar ache in his heart, a longing to see her again, to witness firsthand the relief and hope his secret gesture had brought her. But for now, he contented himself with the quiet certainty that Emily Carter's life had changed tonight, just as she had irrevocably changed his own. Emily walked through the hospital corridors the next morning with a lightness in her step that hadn't been there for months. The heavy burden she'd been carrying seemed to have finally lifted, replaced by a cautious but profound sense of relief. Though exhaustion still lingered in her eyes, something deeper and brighter shone within them now, a rekindled sense of hope. When she entered Henry's room, he immediately noticed the difference in her demeanor. His heart warmed as he saw a genuine smile playing at her lips, a smile he desperately longed to witness. It took considerable effort to maintain his carefully guarded neutrality, to pretend he knew nothing of the reason behind her newfound joy. "You seem different today, Emily," Henry observed gently, pretending casual interest as he watched her carefully adjusting his IV. Emily paused for a moment, glancing up at him with eyes full of gratitude and surprise. "Something amazing happened last night," she admitted softly, unable to hide the emotion that filled her voice. "An anonymous person helped me with my brother's medical bills, someone who somehow understood everything I was going through. I don't even know who it was. But they changed everything." Henry fought back the urge to confess his role, feeling an ache of longing and pride as he saw the immense impact his quiet gesture had made. Instead, he simply nodded thoughtfully, his voice deliberately calm, betraying no hint of his involvement. "It seems someone recognizes the extraordinary person you are." Emily flushed slightly, warmth spreading across her cheeks at his words. She shook her head modestly. "I don't know about extraordinary, but whoever did this, they must have an incredible heart. To help someone they barely know, it's kindness beyond words." Henry's throat tightened painfully. He'd spent years hidden behind a wall of bitterness and skepticism. Yet Emily's sincerity and gratitude shattered that wall piece by piece, leaving him feeling vulnerable, yet strangely liberated. "You deserve it, Emily," Henry whispered sincerely, his voice raw with quiet intensity. "Never forget that." Emily looked deeply into his eyes, touched by the sincerity she saw reflected there. In that moment, an unspoken bond seemed to strengthen between them, a deepening of the mutual respect and care that had slowly blossomed. Henry had begun as a challenge, a difficult patient she struggled to please. Now he felt more like a trusted friend, someone who understood her more profoundly than she'd ever expected. "Thank you, Henry," Emily replied softly, her voice gentle and sincere. "Your kindness these last few days, it means so much." As she left the room, Henry leaned back against his pillows, his heart racing uncomfortably, overwhelmed by emotion. Emily's words echoed in his mind, filling him with warmth and uncertainty. He hadn't anticipated becoming so personally invested when he'd first embarked on this experiment. But now, the thought of Emily ever learning the truth, that he was her anonymous benefactor, both thrilled and terrified him. Alone, he reached beneath his pillow once more, retrieving his notebook. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote beneath her name, adding quietly, "Deserves every happiness." Closing the notebook, Henry Alexander knew with growing certainty that Emily Carter had changed him deeply, and that somehow, some way, he wanted to continue being a reason for her joy. Henry sat alone in the quiet solitude of his hospital room, the soft hum of medical equipment blending into the background, unnoticed. The weight of his secret pressed heavily upon him, gnawing relentlessly at his conscience. Ever since Emily had walked out of his room earlier that day, filled with genuine gratitude and relief over the anonymous help she'd received, a sharp guilt twisted inside him, impossible to ignore. He stared blankly at the ceiling, his mind replaying Emily's sincere words, her grateful eyes bright with unshed tears. The idea that she believed the financial help had come from some distant, unknown benefactor felt increasingly wrong. He knew now that Emily was more than merely deserving. She was extraordinary. He admired her resilience, her unwavering kindness, and above all, her fierce integrity. It felt fundamentally wrong to deceive someone he had grown to respect so deeply. "Have I taken this too far?" he whispered quietly into the empty room, the words filled with a heavy doubt he rarely allowed himself to voice. Henry reached beneath his pillow, pulling out the leather notebook once more. He opened it slowly, fingers tracing the letters of Emily's name written there with quiet reverence. He remembered clearly every moment he'd observed her selfless compassion, every test she'd passed unknowingly, every harsh criticism she'd endured patiently, never losing her essential kindness. He'd started this experiment believing people could be measured through trials and pressure. Now, the morality of his actions deeply troubled him. He wondered painfully how Emily would feel if she learned the truth, that the difficult, stubborn patient she'd patiently cared for was secretly Henry Alexander, billionaire owner of St. Mary's. Would she feel used, betrayed, or worse? Would she regret sharing her vulnerabilities with him? He couldn't bear the thought of damaging the fragile trust they had built. Henry closed the notebook abruptly, frustration surging through him. He had spent a lifetime hiding behind facades and calculated decisions, always in control, never vulnerable. But Emily had changed that. She had unknowingly stripped away layers of cynicism he'd spent years building, leaving him feeling exposed, yet strangely hopeful. He reached for his phone impulsively, fingers hovering uncertainly above James's contact information. Part of him wanted desperately to reveal everything to Emily immediately, to end the deception, to see her expression as she finally understood the sincerity behind his actions. But another part, fearful of losing her entirely, held him back. Henry exhaled heavily, setting the phone aside again. For the first time in decades, the powerful businessman felt utterly conflicted, uncertain of the right path forward. The choice to remain anonymous had been straightforward at first, a logical, controlled experiment. But now emotions had blurred every line he'd carefully drawn, leaving him unsettled and vulnerable. He leaned back, closing his eyes wearily, silently acknowledging the painful truth that he'd underestimated Emily Carter. She was not merely part of an experiment. She had become someone essential to him, someone whose respect and trust he deeply valued. And for the first time, Henry Alexander found himself questioning not just the morality of his actions, but the man he had become, wondering if he was capable of the same honesty and courage Emily showed every day. Henry paced restlessly beside the large window of his hospital room, his eyes distant and clouded with anxiety. Outside, twilight slowly surrendered to darkness, the city lights blinking to life one by one. But his thoughts were far from the comforting beauty of the world outside. For days now, he'd been tormented by indecision, trapped between his desire to maintain Emily's trust and his overwhelming guilt over the truth he'd kept hidden from her. He knew with certainty that the time had come to reveal himself, that Emily deserved to hear the truth directly from him, not through whispers or accidental discovery. Yet the thought of her reaction filled him with dread. Would her admiration, built patiently and painstakingly over weeks, vanish instantly, replaced by betrayal and anger? Could she ever forgive his deception, even if it had started with good intentions? The door opened quietly, startling Henry from his troubled thoughts. Emily entered, carrying his evening medication and fresh bedding, her presence immediately bringing both comfort and anxiety. As she moved about the room with quiet grace, he watched her closely, feeling deeply conflicted. Every passing moment of secrecy felt unbearable, yet revealing himself might mean losing her forever. "You look distracted tonight," Emily observed gently, glancing up to meet his troubled gaze. "Is something bothering you, Mr. Collins?" Henry hesitated, his chest tightening painfully. He wanted desperately to confess everything right then and there, to drop the mask entirely and tell her exactly who he was. But fear held him back, paralyzing his voice. "Emily," he began slowly, his voice tight with uncertainty, "have you ever hidden something because you thought it was for the best, only to realize later it might have been terribly wrong?" Emily paused, setting down the fresh linens carefully. Her thoughtful eyes studied him, filled with empathy and curiosity. "I suppose everyone has at some point," she replied softly, stepping closer. "But I've learned that honesty is always best, even if it hurts at first." Henry's heart raced at her words, knowing their profound truth. "Even if it might cause someone to lose all trust in you?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Emily's expression softened further, sensing his struggle, though not yet understanding its full depth. "Trust can be rebuilt," she assured him gently, her eyes never leaving his. "But it has to start with truth." Henry swallowed painfully, her words echoing deeply within him. He saw the sincerity in her gaze, felt the warmth of her kindness, and realized with startling clarity just how deeply he valued that trust, how much losing it would wound him. "Emily," Henry said finally, his voice shaking slightly with emotion, "there's something important I need to tell you, soon, something I've been keeping hidden." Emily's eyes widened briefly in surprise, but quickly softened again, filled with quiet reassurance. "Whenever you're ready, Mr. Collins," she replied softly. "I'll listen." As she'd left the room, Henry sank onto the edge of his bed, overwhelmed by gratitude for her patience and terrified by what lay ahead. He knew he couldn't delay much longer. The truth had grown too heavy, the deception too painful. He would reveal himself to her, no matter the cost, because he owed her honesty above all else. Henry Alexander, billionaire owner of St. Mary's Hospital, had spent his life accustomed to control and certainty. But in this quiet moment, facing the risk of losing Emily, he found himself humbled, afraid, yet more determined than ever to become the kind of man worthy of the extraordinary woman who had transformed his heart. Emily stood silently, her cheeks burning hotly as her supervisor, Nurse Margaret Stanton, confronted her angrily in the busy corridor, voice sharp enough to draw curious stares from passing staff. "I specifically asked you to organize these patient files yesterday, Emily," Margaret snapped, thrusting the paperwork towards her accusingly. "How many times do I have to repeat myself before you get it right? Your lack of organization is creating chaos, and it's completely unacceptable." Emily's heart hammered painfully, embarrassment flooding through her as several nurses paused their work to watch the unfolding drama. She opened her mouth to protest gently, to explain the impossible workload she'd been shouldering, but Margaret swiftly interrupted. "No excuses!" Margaret's voice rose louder, sharper. "If you can't handle your responsibilities, perhaps nursing isn't the right profession for you." Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears, humiliation twisting painfully inside her chest. She struggled desperately to maintain composure, feeling exposed and unfairly attacked. Just then, a strong voice cut through the tension with unexpected authority. "That's quite enough." Everyone turned sharply toward the sound. Henry stood in his doorway, his typically quiet demeanor now replaced by a formidable presence, eyes blazing fiercely with a rare intensity. He stepped forward, surprisingly steady, leaning only lightly on his cane. "I've witnessed Nurse Carter's dedication firsthand," Henry declared firmly, directing his words squarely at Margaret. "She has shown exceptional care under impossible circumstances, often handling tasks far beyond her duty because others leave their responsibilities unfinished." Margaret stared at Henry, momentarily speechless. Emily's breath caught sharply, overwhelmed by gratitude yet equally stunned by Henry's sudden protective intervention. "Perhaps," Henry continued evenly, his gaze unwavering, "instead of reprimanding one of your best nurses, you should ask why your staff is stretched beyond reason. Blaming Emily won't solve this hospital's deeper issues." Margaret flushed deeply, embarrassment clearly overtaking her previous hostility. Without another word, she hurriedly turned away, disappearing down the corridor amid a hushed silence. Emily stood frozen, her eyes wide, heart pounding, as Henry approached slowly, his expression softening considerably. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered quietly, voice trembling with emotion. "But thank you." Henry gently placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, paternal warmth radiating from his touch. "Someone needed to stand up for you," he replied softly, sincere affection coloring his voice. "You deserve far better treatment than that." Emily smiled faintly, deeply touched by the genuine care in his eyes. In that quiet moment, Henry's protective stance felt profoundly comforting, more like the embrace of a caring family member than the actions of a mere patient. "Come," Henry said gently, guiding her slowly back toward his room. "You need a moment to gather yourself." Inside, he sat quietly, watching as Emily gradually regained her composure. The earlier embarrassment had begun fading, replaced by a calm certainty that she was no longer alone in her struggles. Henry's defense had made her feel respected, valued, and fiercely protected, a sensation she'd long missed. As she quietly thanked him once more and stepped out again, Henry felt a quiet surge of pride, mingled with an unexpected paternal affection he'd rarely experienced before. Emily Carter had touched his heart deeply, awakened protective instincts he'd thought long buried, and as he watched her leave, Henry Alexander knew one thing for certain: he would do whatever it took to ensure she never had to face such humiliation again. The hospital's large conference room buzzed with nervous energy, filled with doctors, nurses, and hospital executives seated around a polished mahogany table. Emily sat quietly in a corner, her fingers nervously twisted in her lap, unsure why she'd even been asked to attend this critical meeting. Across from her, the hospital's administrators spoke in hushed voices, their expressions anxious, whispering about some mysterious announcement that could alter everything. Suddenly the door opened and a collective silence swept through the room. Every head turned to watch as Henry stepped inside, dressed impeccably in a dark tailored suit, a startling transformation from the gruff, demanding patient they all knew. He stood confidently, authority radiating from him, a commanding presence that stunned Emily into confused silence. Her pulse quickened painfully, her throat tightening with sudden dread. Henry's eyes briefly found hers, softening with an unspoken apology before he turned to address the gathering. "Thank you all for coming," he began, voice steady, deeply resonant, commanding instant attention. "Many of you know me as Henry Collins, a difficult patient you've endured for weeks. The truth is, I'm Henry Alexander, the founder and owner of St. Mary's Hospital." Gasps echoed around the room, a wave of disbelief rippling through the shocked staff. Emily felt her heart plummet into her stomach, her breath catching painfully. Everything began spinning. She stared at Henry in disbelief, her mind racing chaotically through the past weeks, the arguments, the kindnesses, the deep emotional conversations they'd shared. All of it, she realized with gut-wrenching clarity, had been built upon a carefully crafted deception. "I came to the hospital in disguise," Henry continued solemnly, eyes now firmly locked on Emily's devastated expression, "to see firsthand the true character and integrity of my staff. While I recognize the method was extreme, what I found far surpassed my expectations." Emily felt tears stinging sharply in her eyes, humiliation burning fiercely within her chest. She was unable to move, unable to speak, feeling utterly betrayed. Her mind flashed to the anonymous check she'd received, realizing suddenly who was truly behind it, the man she'd opened herself to, trusted, and respected deeply. "Emily Carter," Henry said gently, his voice softening significantly. "Your dedication, your compassion, and your selflessness have shown me what true care means. I understand how betrayed you must feel right now, and for that, I deeply apologize." Emily shook her head, unable to meet his eyes. Her chest tightened painfully with anger, betrayal, and a deep sadness that threatened to consume her. "I wanted to make this hospital better for staff and patients alike," Henry continued sincerely, visibly shaken by Emily's hurt expression. "But in doing so, I hurt someone extraordinary. Emily, please know that everything you've experienced was genuine. My respect, my admiration, and above all, my gratitude." The room fell silent, thick with tension. Every gaze moved to Emily, waiting for her response. But Emily felt paralyzed, grief and shock overwhelming her, blurring her vision as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. Without a word, she rose shakily from her chair and quickly left the room, the heavy door swinging closed behind her with a painful finality. Henry stood alone, the quiet tension pressing upon him heavily, his chest aching as he watched her go. For the first time in years, Henry Alexander felt completely powerless, deeply regretful for hurting the one person who had shown him the profound meaning of compassion, and terrified he might have lost her forever. Emily stood alone in the dimly lit hallway, heart racing painfully as she struggled to gather her scattered thoughts. Tears blurred her vision, her breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The betrayal cut deeper than she'd ever imagined possible. Henry Alexander, the hospital's billionaire owner, had disguised himself as Henry Collins, a patient she'd cared for and opened her heart to. The kindnesses, the struggles, the bond they'd built. It was all a lie. The echo of firm footsteps startled her from her painful daze. Turning, she saw Henry approaching slowly, his eyes filled with genuine remorse and uncertainty. Emily's stomach tightened sharply with renewed anger, her jaw clenching as she took a step back, distancing herself from him. "Emily," Henry began softly, his voice strained with sincerity, "please, just let me explain." She shook her head violently, eyes glistening with anger and hurt. "Explain," she demanded, voice trembling with raw emotion. "Explain how everything I believed was real was just some twisted game. You watched me struggle, watched me suffer, pretending you were someone else. How could you do this?" Henry's expression grew pained, his eyes pleading desperately for understanding. "It was never meant to hurt you, Emily. I just needed to see the truth, the reality of how things were run here. But you changed everything. I didn't expect to care so deeply." Emily scoffed bitterly, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. "You didn't care deeply enough to be honest with me. I trusted you. I defended you. And the anonymous money, that was you too, wasn't it? Did you really think throwing money at me could make up for lying?" Henry flinched visibly, her words striking painfully. "I did it because you deserved better, Emily," he whispered quietly, desperation lacing every word. "Your burdens, your strength. I couldn't bear to see you suffer. I wanted to help." "Help!" Emily repeated incredulously, voice breaking sharply. "You manipulated me. You let me believe you were someone who understood me, who cared about me as a person, not just another employee to evaluate. You lied. That isn't help, Henry. That's cruelty." Henry took a hesitant step forward, voice trembling with genuine emotion. "Please, Emily, give me a chance to fix this." Emily held up her hand, stopping him firmly. Her chest felt tight, raw pain replacing every ounce of trust she'd once felt. "I don't know if you can fix this," she whispered harshly, voice shaking with grief and anger. "I don't know if I'll ever trust you again." The corridor fell silent, the weight of her words settling heavily between them. Henry stood motionless, shoulders sagging with quiet despair. Emily met his eyes one final time, searching them briefly for something, anything, to restore the trust that had been shattered so profoundly. But all she saw was regret, sadness, and a vulnerability she couldn't reconcile with the deception she'd endured. Without another word, Emily turned away, leaving Henry standing alone in the empty hallway, overwhelmed by guilt and loss. For the first time, Henry Alexander truly understood the devastating price of his actions, the heartbreaking realization that he might have irreparably destroyed the one genuine bond he'd formed in years, and lost the woman he'd grown to care about more deeply than he'd ever imagined. Henry stood alone in his expansive penthouse overlooking the city, the glittering skyline offering no comfort, only serving as a stark reminder of the emptiness he felt. The heavy silence around him seemed deafening, amplifying the deep ache of regret now consuming him. Emily's words replayed relentlessly in his mind, each accusation slicing painfully through the carefully constructed walls he'd maintained for so long. He moved restlessly to the window, pressing his palm against the cool glass, his eyes reflecting genuine sorrow. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. This wasn't how he'd imagined things would unfold. What had begun as an effort to improve his hospital had turned into something deeply personal, and now he'd managed to ruin everything. For the first time, Henry saw himself clearly, not as a successful businessman or powerful executive, but as someone who'd unintentionally inflicted deep pain on a person he genuinely respected and cared for. He couldn't shake the look of betrayal etched into Emily's face, the devastation in her eyes, as she realized the truth. The hurt he'd caused her seemed impossible to undo, and the weight of that realization threatened to overwhelm him. He sank onto the edge of his elegant leather couch, holding his head in his hands, struggling to control the surge of emotions he'd long suppressed. "What have I done?" he whispered hoarsely into the emptiness, the question echoing bitterly in the stillness. Desperation surged within him. He knew he needed to make amends, yet the path toward reconciliation seemed impossibly unclear. How could he convince Emily of his sincerity, of the genuine care he felt beneath the layers of deception. He had risked the trust and respect of the one person who had ever truly reached him, who had touched his life more profoundly than anyone else. Determined, Henry took a deep breath, forcing himself to rise and cross the room toward his desk. Opening the drawer, he retrieved the familiar leather notebook. Flipping slowly to the page where Emily's name appeared repeatedly, each description reminded him vividly of her kindness, her unwavering compassion, her remarkable strength, all the qualities that had quietly transformed him. He traced his fingers gently over her name, the letters now blurred by his own unshed tears. "I have to fix this," he murmured resolutely. "Whatever it takes. I owe her that." In that quiet moment, a newfound clarity settled within him. Apologies and anonymous gestures would no longer suffice. He would have to prove himself through genuine visible change, both personally and professionally. He knew now that the only way to truly show Emily the depth of his remorse was through action, actions that demonstrated true understanding, humility, and heartfelt regret. Henry carefully set the notebook aside, his heart resolute despite the pain. He had spent his life making decisions based on power, pride, and control, but Emily had changed that forever. For her, he would willingly embrace humility, vulnerability, and honesty, qualities he'd never before considered strengths. As he stood again by the window, Henry Alexander silently vowed to become the person Emily deserved, regardless of whether she ever forgave him. The thought of losing her trust forever terrified him, yet he knew with absolute certainty he had to try. Because Emily Carter was worth every effort, every sacrifice, and deep down, Henry realized he could never live with himself if he didn't do everything in his power to earn back her trust. Emily stood quietly by the edge of the peaceful lake, sunlight shimmering gently on the water, creating small, glistening ripples. The tranquility of her surroundings contrasted sharply with the turmoil raging inside her. For days she'd distanced herself from the hospital, seeking solace far from the familiar walls that reminded her too vividly of the pain Henry's deception had caused. Yet even here, miles away, she couldn't escape thoughts of him, his sincerity, his regretful eyes, the undeniable warmth and kindness she had grown to cherish. She drew in a deep breath, closing her eyes as a gentle breeze brushed softly against her skin. Her heart still ached deeply from the betrayal, yet she couldn't deny that beneath the surface of her hurt lay something more complicated: understanding. Henry's methods had been deeply flawed, but reflecting carefully, Emily realized his intentions had genuinely been good-hearted. He'd acted out of a sincere desire to improve conditions at the hospital, to witness firsthand the true challenges faced by his employees. The anonymous financial help had been an act of genuine compassion intended to ease her burdens, not merely to manipulate or deceive. Emily remembered vividly the times Henry had defended her, his quiet admiration, and the moments of genuine connection they had shared. The memory softened her anger, gradually allowing compassion and understanding to rise alongside her hurt. "He was wrong to lie," she whispered softly to herself, eyes reopening slowly, gazing across the peaceful expanse of water. But maybe his heart was in the right place. The realization felt strangely healing, bringing a quiet sense of peace she hadn't expected. Emily had always prided herself on compassion, on seeing the good in others despite their flaws. Wasn't this situation precisely where her empathy was needed most? Was it fair to judge Henry solely by his mistakes, ignoring the sincerity and regret she'd witnessed so clearly in his eyes? Slowly her heart softened further, acceptance replacing the lingering resentment. Emily knew forgiveness wouldn't be instant nor simple, but it was possible. And perhaps more importantly, she found herself longing to speak to Henry again, to understand more deeply, to mend the fragile trust they had both so carelessly damaged. She turned away from the lake, walking slowly back toward the small, cozy cabin she'd rented for solitude. Her thoughts were clearer now, a quiet determination settling inside her. When she returned to the hospital, she knew she would face Henry differently, not with bitterness, but with compassion. He deserved a chance to prove the sincerity behind his regret, and Emily was finally ready to grant him that chance. As the sun dipped lower, casting gentle golden hues across the landscape, Emily felt hope slowly beginning to bloom within her again. Healing wasn't easy, but it was possible. And perhaps this painful experience had ultimately strengthened her, taught her the true meaning of forgiveness and empathy. Henry Alexander had wounded her deeply, but Emily now realized he had also profoundly changed her, for the better. Emily stepped quietly into the familiar hospital room, her heart thumping nervously against her chest. Henry stood near the window, back turned slightly toward her, gazing thoughtfully out at the bustling city below. For a brief moment she hesitated, uncertain, feeling a wave of vulnerability wash over her. But then he turned, sensing her presence, his eyes immediately softening with gratitude and relief at seeing her again. "Emily," he began gently, stepping cautiously toward her, careful to respect the fragile distance between them. His voice trembled slightly with sincerity and regret. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." She nodded slowly, her gaze cautious but kind, searching his face carefully for sincerity. "I think we both deserve a chance to talk," she replied softly, keeping her emotions carefully guarded, yet unable to hide the compassion that remained. Henry took a deep, steadying breath, clearly gathering his courage. He stepped closer, meeting her eyes directly, his gaze earnest and deeply remorseful. "Emily, I owe you the deepest apology for what I've done, for the deception, the manipulation, the hurt I caused. I never intended to hurt you. Please believe that." She watched him closely, seeing clearly the honesty and vulnerability now reflected in his eyes. "Then why did you?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling gently with the lingering pain of betrayal. "Why not trust us from the beginning?" Henry's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of regret evident in his entire posture. "Because I needed to see the truth firsthand," he admitted quietly. "I founded this hospital believing in compassion and excellence, but I'd lost sight of what that really meant. I became cynical, disconnected. I needed a reminder, a real raw look at how the hospital truly functioned from within. I needed someone genuine enough to restore my faith in compassion and dedication." His voice broke slightly, emotion rising visibly. "Emily, you became that person. Your kindness, your resilience, your integrity, they opened my eyes to the person I'd become, someone I no longer wanted to be. You reminded me of what it truly means to care." Emily's eyes filled slowly with gentle tears, touched deeply by his heartfelt confession. She felt the guarded walls around her heart gradually beginning to crumble, compassion rising once again, softening the pain of betrayal. "And the financial help?" she whispered hesitantly, eyes filled with uncertainty. "Was that just part of your test?" Henry stepped even closer, voice raw with sincerity. "No," he assured her fervently. "That was never a test, Emily. It was a desperate attempt to ease your burden because you deserved kindness, real kindness. You taught me compassion. It was my turn to show it back to you." Emily felt her breath catch softly in her throat, finally understanding the true depth behind his actions. She saw clearly now the deception had been wrong, but beneath it lay sincere, genuine care. Henry had deeply regretted his mistakes, learning something profound and transformative in the process. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Henry continued earnestly, gently taking her hand in a tender gesture filled with respect and affection. "But please, let me try to earn it. I admire you more than I ever thought possible. You've changed my life, Emily. I want the chance to make it right, to become someone worthy of your trust again." Emily's tears fell freely now, softening into a gentle, forgiving smile. She squeezed his hand lightly, warmth filling her heart once again. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she whispered gently. "Even you, Henry." In that quiet moment, as they stood together in mutual understanding, Henry felt profound gratitude and humility fill his heart. Emily Carter had given him the most precious gift imaginable, the chance to earn her trust again. And this time, Henry vowed silently to himself, he would never take it for granted. Emily stood silently beside Henry, the room bathed in a soft golden light that filtered gently through the window blinds. A comforting stillness settled around them, a stark contrast to the emotional storms they had weathered together. Henry watched her closely, his expression a fragile mix of hope and uncertainty, his eyes filled with a quiet longing for forgiveness. She took a deep, calming breath, meeting his gaze fully, allowing herself to see beyond the hurt and betrayal. She saw clearly now, not just Henry Alexander, the billionaire businessman, or Henry Collins, the grumpy patient, but the genuine person beneath it all, a man who had made mistakes yet possessed the courage to face them honestly. "Henry," she began softly, her voice gentle yet firm, "I won't pretend that what you did didn't hurt me deeply. The deception, the lies, they shattered my trust." Henry winced slightly at her words, but nodded slowly, accepting her honesty. "I know," he admitted quietly, voice thick with genuine remorse, "and you have every right to feel betrayed." Emily stepped closer, her expression softening further, filled with compassion. "But I've had time to think about everything, to see things clearly. Beneath the deception, your intentions were good. You were trying to help in your own way. I see that now. Your methods were wrong, but your heart was in the right place." Henry exhaled deeply, relief flooding his features, gratitude shimmering in his eyes. "Emily, your forgiveness is more than I deserve," he murmured sincerely. "I've spent my entire life controlling situations, hiding behind walls. But you showed me another way. You showed me the true meaning of compassion and courage. You've made me want to become a better person." Emily reached out, gently taking his hand in hers, feeling warmth and sincerity radiating from his touch. "Maybe that's what this was all about," she whispered, tears shimmering softly in her eyes. "We both learned something important, about trust, about forgiveness, about ourselves. If we can come through this stronger, then maybe it was all worth it." Henry squeezed her hand gently, deeply moved by her kindness and grace. "You amaze me, Emily Carter," he said softly, voice shaking with raw emotion. "Your strength, your compassion, your ability to forgive. It's something I've never encountered before." She smiled gently, sincerity lighting her eyes with warmth. "We all make mistakes, Henry," she replied softly. "What matters is how we handle them afterward. You've shown genuine remorse, genuine change. That matters." Henry stepped closer still, eyes locked onto hers, a deep understanding and affection passing silently between them. "Can we truly move forward?" he asked hesitantly, vulnerability evident in his voice. Emily nodded slowly, a gentle smile spreading warmly across her face. "Yes," she said quietly but confidently, "because forgiveness isn't just about letting go of the past. It's about choosing to embrace the future, too." Henry felt a profound warmth filling his chest, an overwhelming sense of gratitude and humility washing over him. He knew now that this moment, Emily's forgiveness, was something he would cherish forever, something powerful enough to shape the rest of his life. Together, they stood quietly, their hearts finally aligned, bound by a deeper understanding and a genuine respect born from shared struggles. Henry Alexander, the powerful businessman who had always controlled everything, now felt the beauty of surrender, surrendering to the compassionate, forgiving heart of the remarkable woman standing before him, a woman who had taught him the greatest lessons of his life. The large auditorium of St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with anticipation, filled to capacity with doctors, nurses, administrators, and staff from every department. Emily sat near the back, her heart fluttering nervously, unsure of what exactly Henry had planned. Henry himself stood calmly near the front, impeccably dressed, poised, yet clearly moved by the significance of the moment. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded room, and Emily felt her pulse quicken, warmth spreading gently through her chest. Finally, the room quieted, all eyes turning expectantly toward Henry as he stepped confidently onto the stage, his expression sincere and earnest. "Thank you all for gathering here today," Henry began firmly, his deep voice resonating throughout the auditorium. "As most of you know, I recently spent time at our hospital undercover, witnessing firsthand the true challenges our staff face each day. It was a humbling experience, one that profoundly changed me." Emily felt a gentle flush rise to her cheeks as Henry's eyes found her once more, his gaze filled with warmth and admiration. Her heart raced, anticipating his words yet still unprepared for the depth of his acknowledgement. "During my time here, one person stood out above all others," Henry continued, his voice strong but tender. "Emily Carter's compassion, selflessness, and extraordinary dedication reminded me what healthcare truly means. Her actions, her courage, kindness, and resilience showed me the profound impact nurses have and the burdens they carry so quietly, often without recognition or support." Emily felt tears stinging her eyes, overcome by the sincerity and gravity of Henry's public recognition. Around her, colleagues turned to look at her, pride and admiration shining in their expressions. Henry's voice grew even more passionate, his sincerity unmistakable. "Today, in honor of Emily's selfless care, I announce significant changes at St. Mary's Hospital. Effective immediately, nurse salaries will be substantially increased to reflect the immense value they bring to patient care. Additionally, funding will be provided to hire more support staff, ensuring our nurses never again feel overwhelmed by impossible workloads." The auditorium erupted into spontaneous applause, an emotional outpouring of gratitude and relief from nurses who had long felt undervalued. Emily wiped away tears, heart swelling with overwhelming pride and humility. Henry raised his hand gently, quieting the audience once more. "Further," he added softly, looking directly at Emily with deep sincerity, "the hospital will establish the Emily Carter Care Foundation, dedicated to providing financial assistance to employees facing unexpected hardships, inspired directly by the anonymous kindness that helped Emily in her own time of need." Gasps echoed softly through the room, followed by another wave of heartfelt applause. Emily's vision blurred completely now, emotion flooding through her at the profound generosity of Henry's gesture. "This," Henry said passionately, eyes never leaving Emily's, "is my heartfelt attempt to give back to someone who has given so much, not only to this hospital but to me personally. Emily, thank you for teaching me the true meaning of compassion, courage, and care." As the applause thundered warmly through the auditorium, Emily rose shakily to her feet, deeply moved by the overwhelming support and recognition surrounding her. Henry's grand gesture had touched something deeply within her, healing remaining wounds from his deception and cementing forever the trust and respect they now shared. Standing there, meeting Henry's proud, affectionate gaze across the crowded auditorium, Emily finally understood the profound impact they had both made on each other's lives. Henry Alexander's actions were no longer mere words. They were genuine, meaningful, and lasting changes, born from a heart truly transformed by compassion and love. Emily walked slowly down the bustling halls of St. Mary's, a gentle warmth filling her chest as she took in the remarkable changes around her. Nurses moved with new confidence, their faces brighter, voices less strained, conversations carrying notes of relief rather than exhaustion. The stress that once hung heavily in every corner had gradually lifted, replaced by a renewed sense of pride and optimism that was impossible to ignore. Passing by the nurses' station, Emily paused, listening quietly to snippets of conversation filled with genuine excitement. Her colleagues spoke openly of new resources, manageable workloads, and the sudden ease of balancing professional responsibilities with personal well-being, improvements she knew had come directly from Henry's heartfelt actions and policies. Emily, Nurse Sarah called warmly from behind the desk, her smile radiant. "Can you believe how much things have changed? We're finally getting the respect we deserve." Emily smiled warmly, nodding in heartfelt agreement. "It's amazing, and long overdue." Sarah squeezed her hand affectionately. "We all owe you, Emily. None of this would have happened without you." Emily flushed modestly, warmth spreading gently through her chest at the sincerity in Sarah's eyes. "It was Henry who made this possible," she replied softly, gratitude evident in her voice. "He saw clearly what needed to change." She moved further down the corridor, her heart swelling with quiet pride and deep humility as she witnessed the profound impact of Henry's genuine respect and understanding. Glancing toward a newly renovated staff lounge, she saw groups of nurses gathered comfortably, some laughing softly, others simply relaxing for the first time in months. It felt surreal yet deeply satisfying to know her compassion had played a part in creating this new reality. "Emily," a deep, gentle voice spoke softly behind her, and she turned slowly, her breath catching at the sight of Henry, standing quietly in the hallway, his eyes warm, filled with sincere admiration and gratitude. "Henry," she whispered, smiling gently, stepping closer. "It's incredible. You've changed everything." Henry shook his head gently, his gaze tender and heartfelt. "No, Emily. You changed everything. You taught me the true meaning of compassion and respect. None of this would have happened without your kindness." She looked away briefly, blinking back sudden tears of deep emotion before meeting his eyes again with quiet sincerity. "But you made it real, Henry. These aren't just promises. These are transformative changes. You've truly made a difference." Henry took her hands gently in his, the warmth of his touch filling her heart with deep comfort and trust. "We made this difference together," he replied softly, voice thick with genuine affection. "You've given me something invaluable, hope, purpose, the courage to lead from the heart. I'll never forget that." Emily squeezed his hands lightly, her eyes bright with gratitude and pride. "Neither will I," she whispered gently. "This hospital, our colleagues, their lives, they're better now because of you." Henry's expression softened further, deep emotion evident in every line of his face. "And because of you," he reminded her quietly. "Your compassion inspired all of this. I owe you more than I could ever express." As they stood quietly in the corridor surrounded by a hospital transformed by empathy and genuine care, Emily felt profoundly honored, deeply touched to have inspired such lasting change. The wounds from past betrayal had healed fully now, replaced forever by mutual respect, trust, and genuine affection. She understood with clarity the power of compassion, the ability to heal, inspire, and transform, changing not only institutions but also hearts. Standing beside Henry, Emily finally felt the true depth of what they'd accomplished together. Their lives, and the lives of countless others, had been forever changed, proof that kindness, understanding, and love could indeed transform the world. Sunlight streamed gently through the large windows of St. Mary's Hospital, casting a golden glow across the bustling lobby filled with staff and visitors. Emily moved gracefully among them, confidence and warmth radiating from her, greeting nurses, doctors, and patients alike with genuine care. She had become a familiar and beloved presence within these walls, her quiet strength and compassion inspiring everyone she encountered. From across the lobby, Henry watched her proudly, his heart swelling with deep affection and respect. Gone was the man who had hidden behind a mask of bitterness and cynicism. In his place stood someone who genuinely cared, who openly showed kindness and humility, grateful for the profound transformation Emily had inspired within him. He walked slowly toward her, smiling softly as she turned to meet his gaze, her eyes bright with warmth. Their relationship had grown into something beautiful and rare, more than mere friendship, now truly like family, bound by mutual respect, trust, and deep affection. "Busy morning?" Henry asked gently, falling easily into step beside her, his voice warm and familiar. Emily smiled warmly, glancing up at him with gentle amusement. "Busy is good. It means we're helping, and the changes we've made, they're working, Henry. You can feel it everywhere." Henry nodded quietly, deeply moved. "It's because of you, Emily. Your kindness showed me the way forward, reminded me of what truly matters." Emily gently squeezed his arm, voice softening sincerely. "We showed each other, Henry. Compassion is contagious. You started something remarkable here." Together they moved slowly down the hallway, each greeting staff warmly, stopping briefly to comfort an anxious patient or encourage a tired nurse. Their combined presence felt deeply reassuring, a tangible example of leadership rooted in genuine care. "Do you ever wonder," Henry asked quietly, thoughtfully, as they paused by the nurse's station, "how different things would have been if you hadn't come into my life?" Emily glanced at him, her expression thoughtful and sincere. "I think things happen for a reason. We found each other because we both needed to learn something about compassion, trust, forgiveness. Together, we've grown. Maybe this was always meant to be." Henry's expression softened deeply, emotion shimmering warmly in his eyes. "You're right. And now we have a responsibility to take what we learned and continue making a difference, not just here, but in the entire community." Emily nodded resolutely, determination shining in her gaze. "Then let's keep moving forward, Henry. Let's keep inspiring others, showing them what's possible when kindness leads the way." He placed a comforting hand gently on her shoulder, voice filled with profound gratitude and affection. "There is no one I'd rather have by my side." They shared a quiet, tender glance, a moment filled with unspoken gratitude for the journey they'd traveled together. Around them, the hospital continued bustling with life and hope, a testament to the profound impact their compassion and leadership had already created. As they resumed their walk, Henry felt a profound sense of fulfillment and purpose, a new beginning he had never anticipated. Emily, too, felt deeply honored to stand beside someone whose transformation she'd helped inspire. They moved forward together, their hearts fully aligned, forever changed by each other's kindness and sincerity. Together, Henry and Emily had created not just improvements within a hospital, but a true legacy, a lasting, meaningful impact built upon trust, compassion, and genuine care. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes a single act of kindness could transform not only one life, but an entire community, creating a brighter, more compassionate world for everyone.